At dawn, the high-speed train slid from New York toward Washington, D.C., carrying executives' aides and one billionaire father. Inside the VIP car, light glinted on glass tables, leather seats, laptops, watches, and a cradle gripped by trembling hands. Noah began crying before the Hudson vanished behind concrete and towers, and the sound cut through whispers, music, and smiles. The baby arched red-faced lips, turning blue between gasps, fighting for air as panic raced through his father tonight. People lifted phones like shields and lenses, caught every sound, every tremor, every failure of control in the crowded car. A woman across the aisle hissed about irresponsibility, while a man muttered lawsuits and custody and pure public disgrace nonsense. The attendant stiffened near the door fingers, brushing the radio, preparing words that meant removal, not comfort for the disturbance. Ethan felt his heart collide with memories of doctors, shouting monitors screaming, and a wife who never came back home. He checked Noah's mouth airway chest again, counting breaths like a prayer that shook his hands in front of strangers. Someone shouted that a baby that sick should not be on public transport, where everyone else must suffer the noise. Another voice threatened security, and the word police rolled like thunder along the aisle, sending a visible shiver through passengers. Ethan rose halfway blocked by knees and bags and fear of collapsing before he could save his son at all. That was when Ava stood up from the middle row, without permission, without apology, without hesitation, and every eye turned. Her hands were steady as she crossed the narrow space and took Noah from Ethan's arms before he could protest. A passenger screamed, "Put that baby down, or I'm calling the police right now for safety." As others shouted agreement, Ava pressed Noah against her chest, tilted his cheek to hear breath and heart, and began to sing softly now. The song was old, simple, barely sound, yet every note carried calm through shaking limbs that moments ago knew terror. Noah's body shuddered once, lips purple, then pink again, eyes fluttering as oxygen found its path back home to him. In 5 seconds, the cry ended as if a switch had been turned by faith, and the car fell silent. The phones kept filming, yet no one spoke, and even the attendant forgot her script as reality reset before them. Ethan sank back into his seat, empty-armed, watching a stranger hold the only life he had left in silence. Tears cut lines through Ava's composure, but her voice never wavered as the lullaby continued, threading courage through the terror. Noah's fingers curled into the fabric at her shoulder, as if he finally trusted the world again with a sigh. Around them, judgment drained into awe and fear into breath, and the threat dissolved into fragile peace that felt borrowed. The attendant stepped back with eyes lowered and a nod that asked nothing and promised everything in that fragile moment. Ethan finally found his voice and whispered thank you, though it sounded small to him beside the miracle she worked. Ava did not answer. She only kept singing and watched Noah breathe, as if counting grace that might run out. The train cut through miles of winter fields and rivers, while a new quiet settled inside the car at last. Ethan studied the woman who had saved his son and saw exhaustion, courage, and something painfully familiar in her eyes. Ava kept her gaze on Noah, as if afraid that looking up would undo the spell that held him safe. Outside stations blurred past, and time loosened its grip, as strangers shared one impossible memory that would divide and bind. Ethan did not yet know her name or story, only that his world had shifted, on rails meant for strangers. Ava did not yet know his empire, his scandals or the knives hidden in boardrooms that waited for her blood. All she knew was the child who almost slipped away and the breath she pulled back with song and will. The carriage remained hushed, as if everyone feared disturbing the fragile victory over panic that had nearly claimed a life. Ethan felt shame, pride, terror, relief, and a strange rising gratitude he did not resist as it filled his chest. He thought of hospitals and signatures and promises made to a woman who never saw this morning or heard this. Ava felt the weight of eyes and law and danger, yet she did not release the child even for breath. Noah slept now, a small warmth against her heart, as if he chose her in trust without a single word. The threat receded, but its echo lingered in Ethan's mind, like a storm line beyond sight that still promised violence. He did not hear the warning coming toward him through offices' contracts and a different kind of gunfire called headlines. Ava shifted Noah gently and prepared to return him as the train slowed near the Capitol where power waited awake. Their eyes met for the first time without terror between them, and something unspoken moved through the space they shared. Ethan reached out, then stopped, his hand suspended by fear of breaking what had saved them from that final cry. He did not know yet that the woman saving his son was the daughter of his enemy waiting to strike. Ethan watched Ava return Noah to his arms with care, and when her fingers released the fabric of his jacket, the weight of the moment fell back onto him at once, and the silence of the car cracked into motion again as the train eased into Washington, and the memory he had tried to lock behind glass surged forward without mercy. The room white and too bright, the smell of antiseptic cutting through his lungs. As alarms pulsed and voices overlapped, and Isabella lay pale on the table, still smiling at him, like she believed joy alone could fix what blood was stealing away by the second, and he had believed it too, because belief had always bent the world to his will, until a surgeon grabbed his shoulder and said, "We are losing her, and need your consent now." And the form was placed into his shaking hand with 2 boxes that split his life in half, save the mother or save the child, and he felt his knees weaken under a decision no wealth on earth could soften. He remembered how her fingers were cold when he kissed them, and how she whispered, "Do not let him be alone," and how he signed with a stroke that felt like murder, even though everyone told him it was mercy and necessity and the only way forward. He remembered pacing the hall, counting steps, because numbers had always saved him when emotions threatened to drown him. And then the scream came not from his wife, but from the nurse announcing a boy alive and breathing, while in the next breath the doctor said, "Time of death for Isabella Blackwood." After that, the world had not stopped, but it had lost sound for a while, and he had stood with a newborn he was too afraid to hold, because every breath felt like theft from a woman who never took another. Tonight, on this train with Noah warm in his arms, and strangers still whispering, the old fear returned, that he was unfit, that he had failed at the only job that mattered before it even began. That fear followed him into headlines that named him the billionaire single father, as if grief were a brand and weeks turned into months, where every public appearance became an audit of his heart, cameras hunting for cracks in a face, trained for earnings, calls not funerals. In boardrooms of mirrored glass, directors warned him that weakness frightened markets, and he answered with strategy and numbers, while inside he measured nights by the sound of breathing, Through a monitor, terrified the pattern would stop, as Isabella had suddenly and without apology. A columnist once asked how it felt to be both the richest man in the room and the most helpless, and he ended the interview without a smile, because the answer would have undone him. He paid for nurses, trainers, pediatric specialists, and security that hovered like ghosts, yet he had never learned the simple courage of believing his own hands were enough. The board tolerated his distraction with thin patience and then with formal concern as losses from delayed projects stacked, and a rumor slipped into meetings that he had lost control the same way he had lost his wife. Tonight, the whisper had followed him onto the rails and bloomed into threat, with a phone held up like evidence and a voice that spoke the word police, as if it were a verdict rather than a precaution. He felt the echo of that hospital pen again when Ava lifted Noah without permission, and salvation arrived in the form of defiance that did not belong to him. The humiliation cut deep because relief was louder than pride, and he hated himself for needing it so badly. He knew what the headlines would say if the video spread that the mighty could not quiet a child, that strangers intervened where fortune failed, and he felt the board counting votes somewhere in the dark. When Noah slept at last and the train slowed, he realized he was shaking, not from fear for his son now, but from the delayed shock that he had nearly watched helplessness take another life while the world recorded. In the dim reflection of the window, he saw not a titan of industry, but a man who still stood in corridors with blood on forms that never washed off. He did not look at Ava as she stepped away, because the gratitude felt dangerous, like a promise his luck did not deserve. When the doors opened and Washington breathed its power into the aisle, he gathered his things with care as though haste might wake the past, and he thought of the vow he never spoke again after the funeral, that he would never be powerless over the people he loved. Yet tonight he had been powerless, and that truth followed him onto the platform heavier than any briefcase, while somewhere above the city drones of media waited, and in rooms of polished wood questions hardened into strategies against a man accused of losing control. Ava remained standing long after the train stopped, feeling the echo of Noah breathing against her chest, as if the rhythm still lived in her bones, and in that echo the past opened its door without asking. She had learned the sound of a child slipping towards silence in a narrow apartment above a laundromat, where steam never quite left the walls, and exhaustion sat like dust on every surface. Her husband, Miguel, had been a city maintenance worker who kissed their daughter Sophia on the forehead every night, as if building a memory to last him through whatever danger waited below ground. The night did come sooner than she ever imagined, when a faulty signal sent a train into chaos beneath the city, and the call arrived as a voice that did not belong to the life she had known. After the funeral, the world demanded motion, and she gave it what it wanted by returning to nursing school with grief wrapped tight around her ribs like a brace that kept her upright even when she forgot how to breathe. Sophia had been 6 months old when the crying first broke Ava apart in the dark, a sound so thin and helpless that it felt like the universe itself begging to be held. Ava would sit on the edge of the bed with her daughter pressed to her chest, singing what her mother had once sung to her in Spanish, that same slow lullaby of survival that counted breaths and promised morning. There were nights when the crying lasted hours, until Ava's voice went raw, and her arms trembled so badly she feared she would drop the child she was trying to save from fear. Those nights taught her what terror sounded like when it lived inside a small body, and what to do when it tried to steal the air from lungs that were not yet strong. Tonight, on the train, that sound had split the car in two, and Ava did not think of laws or cameras or the shape of a man's power. She thought only of the color she had seen in Noah's face, and the silence that had come after in Sophia. The one moment a mother learns that no rule matters more than breath. She had stood without planning it and crossed the aisle without thinking of danger, and taken the child because instinct outran reason, with a speed she trusted more than any training. When Noah's breath returned and the car froze, she felt the old burn behind her eyes that came whenever a life stepped back from the edge and left her holding the aftershock alone. Now the baby slept in his father's arms, and Ava found she could look at the man at last. Ethan's gaze carried a wild gratitude and a shadow of dread so familiar that it startled her because she had seen it in mirror glass for years. They did not speak at first, and the quiet between them was not empty. It was full of the lives that had shaped the moment they shared without names. Ava saw the question in his eyes, the unspoken why that followed courage, and she answered it with a truth that surprised her as well. "I have heard that cry before," she said softly, and her voice did not shake when she admitted it because it had shaken enough in the past. He asked with only his eyes, and she continued because something in his fear asked for honesty without defense. "My husband died in a subway accident," she said, "and for a while my daughter cried like she was falling forever, and I learned how to pull her back." The words moved between them like a bridge made of air, and for a breath the noise of the platform faded. Ethan did not offer sympathy in the easy way that people who fear other people's pain often do. He simply nodded as if he recognized the place grief lived and left it untouched. Ava felt the first thread of connection tighten than not love, not hope yet, but recognition stronger than politeness. She looked down at Noah and watched his chest rise smooth and sure, and felt that strange tenderness that had guided her hands against every warnings still glow in her palms. When she lifted her eyes again, Ethan was still watching her as if she had performed something holy, and she almost flinched at the intensity because no one had looked at her that way since the life she lost. The romantic tension did not announce itself with fireworks. It lived in the narrow space where breath met and then pulled back before it could become too much. Ava turned her gaze aside first, not because she lacked feeling, but because she felt too much, and had learned that longing was dangerous when unfinished grief still wrote the rules of her heart. Ethan seemed to understand the retreat, as if distance were another language both had learned while surviving separate storms. They spoke a little more of nothing, of the inconvenience of the delay, of the strange weather of the capital, but every word bent around what they did not say. And when their eyes met again, the silence rang louder than speech. Ava felt a warm ache at the thought that she would leave this man behind on the platform and never know how his story would end, but she had lived long enough with endings to know some beginnings were safer as memories than as risks. When the attendant signaled for movement, Ava stepped back and smoothed her jacket with hands that no longer trembled. Because the crisis had passed, yet the aftershock remained. Ethan shifted Noah carefully as if handling porcelain, and for a moment Ava considered telling him her name, but the thought of claiming this moment felt like touching a flame she could not afford to hold. They exchanged one last look across the narrow space between them, and in that look lived the promise of something neither dared to imagine into shape. Ava turned toward the platform and felt the cold air of late winter hit her face, like a reminder that all warmth must end if it is not guarded. And as she walked away, with her bag on her shoulder and the echo of a lullaby in her throat, she wondered without letting herself hope whether the man with the sleeping child would remember the woman who remembered crying. Ethan chose the seat beside Ava as the train pulled from the platform and gathered speed again, and the decision felt larger than the distance between two cushions, because it changed the air between them at once. Noah slept between them in the crook of his arm, and every breath the child took seemed to set the tempo of the small space they now shared, as if the train itself were keeping time for two wounded lives inching closer without daring to touch. Ethan watched Ava in the reflection of the window, first rather than directly, because it felt safer to see her that way, less exposed, less revealing, and yet the glass gave him no shelter from the quiet gravity of her presence. She stared ahead with hands folded in her lap posture, composed, but he could tell by the tension in her shoulders that she was still bracing for a danger that had already passed, because fear learned in loss does not loosen simply because the storm has moved on. He wanted to speak and found himself afraid of the sound of his own voice, as if a word might shatter the fragile peace she had restored with song. When he finally did speak, it was to comment on the skyline sliding by like any other traveler, but his words carried a softness he did not recognize in himself, and she answered with a small smile that lifted and fell quickly, like a wing-testing air. The more they sat, the more the background noise of the car receded, until the murmurs of other passengers felt distant and unreal, as if the two of them had slipped into a pocket of quiet inside motion where grief could breathe without being watched. Ethan found himself studying the curve of her cheek when she turned just enough to glance at Noah, and the sight pierced him with a tenderness sharpened by everything he had lost. Ava felt his gaze before she met it, and when she did, their eyes held for a heartbeat too long, and the romantic tension that had been hiding now rose, with a timid insistence that surprised them both. It was not heat that moved between them, but recognition and restraint, like a door that the wind keeps nudging, but that both hands hold closed from either side. They leaned in as the train swayed, and for a moment their shoulders nearly met, separated only by the sleeping child and the fragile rules they carried inside. Ava could feel Ethan's breath hitch, and knew that he felt hers as well, and the awareness sent a quiet tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. She thought of Miguel and of the promise she had buried with him that she would not invite another man into the shadow of his absence too soon, if ever, because grief guards what it once loved with jealous hands. Ethan thought of Isabella and of the way he had failed to save her with all the money and influence he commanded, and the thought tightened his chest with a vow he did not speak, that he would not reach for something he did not deserve. Noah shifted softly between them in sleep, and his small sound broke the moment like a bell that called both of them back from the edge of what might have been. Ava turned her face first again, retreating with grace, and Ethan accepted the distance as if it were a shared decision rather than a quiet refusal. Minutes passed in the kind of silence that grows dense with what has not been said, and Ethan watched the countryside blur into winter color, thinking that the speed outside mocked the careful pace at which his heart was now forced to move. Ava watched the reflection of stations and lights slide across the glass and wondered why the man beside her felt familiar in a way that frightened her more than strangers ever had. She could feel his concern for his child like a physical warmth, and it stirred a memory of a man who had held their daughter with the same reverent awkwardness, as if love were something fragile that might break if handled without care. Ethan shifted Noah slightly to ease the pressure on the child, small back, and his hand brushed Ava's sleeve by accident, and both of them startled as if struck by a spark, drawn from a dry winter sky. Neither apologized because the touch had not been an error, only an awakening they were not ready to name. The space between their arms felt suddenly loud, and every breath seemed to trace the narrow distance with impossible precision, as if the air itself were drawing lines they could see only by what they did not cross. Ava felt the pull to lean in and test whether proximity would calm or shatter her, and she resisted because she had learned that some questions carry answers too heavy to lift in public light. Ethan felt the same pull and the same restraint, and for the first time since Isabella died, he understood that desire could arrive without shouting, that it could whisper and still command attention. They spoke again of practical things, of how long the trip would take, of the inconvenience of delay, and the conversation moved with a careful politeness that disguised the current running beneath. When the train swayed through a curve, Ava instinctively steadied Noah with her fingertips, lightly against the blanket, and the small protective gesture struck Ethan with such force that he had to look away, lest she read the gratitude in his eyes as something more dangerous than he could manage. The near kiss came without warning when the lights dimmed briefly as the train passed through a tunnel and the shadows pressed them closer together than they expected. For a fraction of a second, their faces aligned in the dark, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath, and she could smell the clean scent of soap and winter on his coat. And the world narrowed to that intimate space where choice waits. Ava turned her face away at the last instant, and the moment passed like a held note released back into the noise of motion, but its echo lingered in both their chests long after the lights returned. Ethan did not chase the movement, he honored it as a boundary drawn with courage rather than rejection, and in that respect, a new respect took root. The rest of the ride unfolded in a delicate balance of presence and restraint, and when at last the train approached the platform where they would part, the realization settled between them with surprising weight. Ava felt a sadness she did not argue with, because some meetings change us even when they are brief, and she adjusted her bag as if preparing for a journey longer than a flight of steps onto concrete. Ethan lifted Noah gently and rose with the crowd, his body moving on instinct, while his mind clung to the quiet they had shared and the question he had not dared to ask. For one suspended breath, they stood facing each other with the hum of the train at their backs and the future at their feet, and the unspoken shimmer of what might be between them lingering in the space they still did not cross. Ava stepped onto the platform with the crowd, and the cold cut through her jacket, as if the city itself were reminding her that warmth always comes with a price. She walked fast, not because she was in a hurry, but because slowing might let Ethan catch up with the question in his eyes that she could not afford to answer. At the bottom of the escalator, a bank of screens flared with headlines and moving tickers, and one phrase stopped her breath so sharply she had to grip the rail to stay upright. Blackwood versus Morales scrolled in bold letters across a financial feed as analysts debated a hostile maneuver set to unfold at market open. Her father's name filled the screen beneath Ethan's last name, like a warning written in light. Victor Morales was smiling in an archived photo arms, folded with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to win, and who had never forgiven his daughter for the choice that cost him control. Ava felt the old knot tighten in her chest as memory moved her backward in time to a dining room where crystal glasses rang with anger and love turned to conditions that shattered when she refused to abandon Miguel for a marriage that would have purchased her back into obedience. Victor had told her she was choosing poverty, choosing obscurity, choosing suffering, and when she did not turn back, he had erased her from his life with the efficiency he used to erase competitors. Even the news of the accident that killed Miguel reached him through lawyers and assistants, and his single message arrived through an intermediary with a line that said he was sorry for the inconvenience. Ava had learned then that there were losses wealth could not feel and protection's power would never give. She had cut her last name from her name like a wound that would not heal cleanly, and built a life that fit between shifts and childcare and night classes with no room for men who bargained in absolutes. Now the screen showed that Victor had not been idle and that Ethan was the target of a plan sharpened long before tonight. She understood at once why fate had chosen a train rather than a courtroom for their meeting, because irony always burns hotter when it is precise. Ava imagined Ethan in his mirrored office at dawn, unaware that the woman who sang his child to sleep carried the blood of the man who meant to break him, and the thought left her dizzy with fear and guilt that arrived together like twins. She feared what it would mean if Ethan learned who she was, and she feared more what it would mean if he did not, because secrets grow teeth when left unattended. A message buzzed on her phone from a number she had not saved yet never forgot, and her body reacted before her mind caught up. It had been months since Victor last tried to reach her, and the silence had felt less like peace than the gathering breath before another storm. The message was short and cold, asking if she had seen the news and adding that the world was about to learn who truly ran the rails of the city. Ava deleted it without reply, yet his voice stayed with her, as if he had spoken the words aloud, in the same measured tone he had used when ordering her life long ago. She walked into the street where traffic blurred into sound and light, and let the noise cover the way. Her hands were trembling. Every instinct urged her to warn Ethan, to tell him to prepare for an attack that would arrive disguised as inevitability, but the thought of stepping into his world with a truth branded by her father's name made her stomach tighten. What would he see if she said Morales? Would he remember the kindness first or the threat it now carried? She pictured the moment again in the train when the carriage fell silent and fear retreated, and for the first time since Miguel she had been seen not as a problem to solve or a resource to manage, but as a person whose presence mattered in an unscripted way. That memory was fragile, and she feared it might not survive the weight of inheritance and corporate war. She reached her apartment and set her bag down with quiet care, as if the walls might judge her fear, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and let the truth settle fully into her bones. Victor Morales had disowned her for loving a man without power and for choosing a life that did not serve his ambition, and now the path she had chosen had curved back to intersect with his feud in a way she had never imagined. She imagined Noah in Ethan's arms and felt a pulse of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity because she had known the child for minutes. Yet the bond formed in crisis felt older than time. The idea that Victor might use a baby as leverage in any form chilled her more than the winter air on the platform had. She knew his methods. He preferred pressure that could be denied in public, but not escaped in private, and he had never missed an opportunity to prove that devotion was a weakness to be exploited. Ava paced the small living room, listening to the building settle, and thought about the last time she had heard her father's voice in the same city on a different night, when he told her she would crawl back when the world showed her how little mercy it had for women who stepped out of line. She had not crawled back then, but tonight the world had shown her mercy in the face of a stranger, and she feared how quickly that mercy could be twisted into a weapon in the hands of a man who believed in ownership above all things. She pulled out the scrap of paper she always carried that held the name she used at work and the one she had abandoned, and she read Morales once as if testing a word that still carried power despite her refusal to answer it. Her fear was not only for herself now, but for Ethan, who did not yet know the battlefield that had chosen him or the connection that tied him to the enemy he would wake to fight. She imagined his face when the truth came out and wondered whether the softness she had seen there could survive the betrayal that his world would call inevitable. Ava sank into the chair by the window and watched the streetlights blink on in sequence, like a quiet warning system that offered no guidance, only a count of time passing. She understood that the secret of her last name had shifted from a shield to a fuse, and that the next days would test whether the bond formed in a train car could withstand a war built long before the lullaby began. Ethan followed the flow of passengers toward the exit. With Noah held close and the sound of Ava steps ahead of him felt louder than the brakes and voices around them, because every instinct pressed him to close the distance before the platform carried her out of reach. The city air rushed in cold and sharp, and with it the certainty that whatever had passed between them inside the train would not survive hesitation. He called out once not her name, which he did not yet know, but a simple weight that sounded too small for the urgency inside his chest. Ava slowed but did not stop at first, as if she were testing whether she could outrun what she already felt pulling at her spine. When she finally turned, the crowd parted, just enough to leave them facing each other with Noah between them, like a quiet bridge and a boundary all at once. For a moment, neither spoke, because the echo of the nearly kissed moment still lived in their breath, and words felt heavier than silence. Ethan broke first with an honesty that surprised him because he had not planned it, and planning had governed his life for so long that spontaneity felt like a rebellion. "I do not usually ask for anything," he said, and the confession sat between them as naked as a fact might be in a room of mirrors. Ava watched his mouth shape the words and felt her resolve waver because she saw again the man who had stood helpless before a child and then trusted her without armor. Ethan shifted Noah slightly, as if presenting the truth of his need without persuasion, and Ava felt the tug of that truth in her chest before she smothered it with caution learned the hard way. He asked for her number with a restraint that honored the distance she had already drawn, and that gentleness cut deeper than any demand could have. Ava shook her head once, not in refusal of him, but in defense of a life she had built with careful limits. After ruins taught her what love could cost. "I cannot," she said softly, and the words tasted like an apology she did not want to make, because choice does not need excuse, yet still asks for forgiveness when it hurts someone else. Ethan felt the absence of insult in her refusal, and that made it harder to accept because he could not dismiss her as unkind or fearful. He took a breath that trembling moment demanded, and asked instead if there were a way to say thank you beyond this single word that kept failing him. Ava hesitated and then reached into her bag with fingers that trembled just enough to betray the battle she was fighting inside herself. She tore a slip from a worn pad and wrote an address and the name of the hospital where she worked in neat, steady letters that did not match the churn in her heart. "If you ever need a nurse," she said, and the formality of the sentence shielded them from what it did not say. Ethan folded the paper carefully, as if it were fragile, and then did something that surprised them both by pressing it against his chest for a beat, before tucking it into his pocket as though he were placing it among the few things he trusted to remain. Noah stirred and released a small sound that reached toward Ava, and the sound cut through her defenses like a thread pulled loose from a careful stitch. She leaned closer without thinking and brushed her knuckles against the back of Noah's hand, a touch so brief it might have been air, yet it carried the full weight of goodbye. Ethan watched the gesture with an intensity that hurt because it looked like the beginning of something he had already lost. For a moment the crowd fell away again, and the city noise softened into a distant surf that made their small island of separation feel enormous. Ava took one step backward, then another, and each retreat felt like an act of will that strained against the pull that had formed where two broken histories had met and found unexpected recognition. Ethan did not follow because he understood that pursuit would undo what little dignity the moment still held, and he did not want to turn gratitude into pressure. Noah opened his eyes and fixed them on Ava as she moved away, and his face crumpled with a small confusion that rose into a cry, too thin to reach panic, yet too real to ignore. The sound reached Ava before memory could, and she stopped again with her shoulders rigid, as though a cord had tightened between her and the child. She turned back slowly and met Ethan's gaze once more, and in that exchange lived every question neither dared to voice about what might have been, if timing were kinder and lineage less sharp. Ethan lifted Noah slightly toward her, as if asking without words whether she might grant them one last spell of calm, and Ava felt her resolve crack just enough to let hope breathe before she forced it closed again. She did not take the child this time, though the instinct was there. Instead, she leaned in and whispered his name, once into the warm space near his ear, and the sound settled him with a quiet that felt like forgiveness. Noah reached out and caught a strand of her hair, and Ava froze with a soft laugh caught in her throat as Ethan gently freed the thread from the small fist that already understood loss better than years. Ava stepped back again, and this time she did not pause, because if she did, she might stay, and staying would pull her into a future she did not yet dare to imagine. Surviving the truth she carried, she turned away with tears bright in her eyes that she did not wipe, because tears were not weakness anymore. They were simply the proof that something had mattered. Ethan watched her go with a stillness that felt like restraint, and with it the unfamiliar ache of choosing to let go before holding on became a promise he could not yet keep. The crowd filed between them, and the gap widened into absence as Ava disappeared into the city with the echo of a lullaby she would never sing again for him. Or so she told herself, because endings are easier to endure when they sound final. Ethan stood until the flow thinned and the platform emptied, and only then did he look down at the paper in his pocket, as if to confirm that the moment had been real and not a mercy dream born of terror and relief. He lifted Noah close and whispered that they would be fine, though the words felt like a wish rather than a certainty, and the train behind them sighed as if it too were sorry for the parting. 10 months passed like a series of quiet echoes rather than loud events, as if the world decided to move gently around two people who had learned the cost of sudden change. Noah learned to stand by, gripping the edge of the couch, and then let go in short, brave bursts that always ended in Ethan's arms with laughter that startled him anew every time. The first time Noah said, "Daw," it landed in Ethan's chest with a force that almost brought him to his knees, because the word carried not only love but responsibility, stripped of every illusion. Night settled into a rhythm of bottle stories and the hum of machines outside the window, while Ethan sat beside the crib and played again and again the low recording of the lullaby Ava had sung on the train. He did not know why he kept it, except that the sound steadied him when dread whispered that every good thing he touched would vanish if he trusted it too much. In boardrooms, 10 months changed everything and nothing, as the war between Blackwood and Morales hardened into headlines and legal storms that made the city hum with speculation. Ethan kept his voice even and his posture controlled, while inside his thoughts drifted to the woman whose name he finally learned from the slip of paper he never dared to use. He told himself that restraint was respect, yet the line between respect and fear thinned with every night. He whispered gratitude into the dark without a recipient. Across the city, Ava lived by the clock of emergency rooms and sleepless dawns, as she moved from trauma to trauma with hands that no longer trembled, even when her heart wanted to. Sophia grew fast in the way children do when survival teaches them to hurry, and she asked once about the crying baby on the train with the serious wonder of a child who remembers things adults try to forget. Ava answered only that sometimes people meet when they need each other most, and then learn how to say goodbye before the world grows complicated. The answer satisfied Sophia in the simple way children accept truth when it is offered without armor, though Ava felt the weight of what she had left unsaid settle into her spine. On nights when exhaustion dulled every edge, Ava found herself humming the lullaby again without meaning to, and the habit startled her as if memory had chosen a life of its own. She wondered whether Noah still slept to that sound, and whether Ethan still believed the woman who had crossed an aisle without permission was safer as an absence than a choice. The messages from Victor Morales came more often as the corporate battle intensified and Ava learned to read threat in silence rather than words as she had been taught, long before she learned to suture flesh. She did not answer him yet. The presence of his pressure threaded every shift like a distant alarm that never quite stopped. Ethan watched news segments with the sound turned low, while reporters traced lines between companies and power and families, and he felt an unease he could not name whenever Ava last name appeared beneath graphics that promised conflict. He did not yet connect the name to her because memory protects what it cannot afford to lose, and he had not reached the moment when the truth would demand its place. Noah took his first steps toward Ethan across the living room with a plastic toy clutched like treasure and fell forward into waiting arms. And the triumph in that simple act lifted Ethan's spirit higher than any stock surge ever had. He sent a silent thanks to the woman he had not seen since the platform, because some gifts change the measure by which all others are counted. Ava watched Sophia learn to spell her name with careful pride at the kitchen table, and felt the familiar ache of wanting more than she dared to claim. She wondered what Noah might be learning now, and whether his father had found the courage she saw flicker behind his restraint. Sometimes on the late shift, she glanced toward the rail line that slid past the hospital in a ribbon of light, and imagined a car moving through the night, carrying a man who might still be listening to a song he did not fully understand. Ethan drove past the hospital once by accident, on a night when Noah slept at last and a restless energy drove him into the streets, and he did not slow, though the building glowed with the promise of answers he was not ready to seek. 10 months made a habit of longing that learned to speak in whispers rather than demands, and both of them learned to live with the sound as if it were part of the world rather than a signal to move. They both carried on with lives that others would call full yet. In the quiet spaces between work and sleep, each heard an echo that belonged to a moment on a train that had refused to fade. Night dropped without ceremony over the city, and the fever began with a heat Ethan felt before the thermometer ever confirmed it, as Noah's skin burned against his palm and his breathing turned shallow and uneven in a way that resurrected every corridor of fear he thought time had quieted. He drove through red lights with hands steady only because terror had taught him how to move, when thought would fail and the hospital rose before him like a cliff of white glass and emergency sound. Inside the ER, the air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant and urgency, as nurses moved with practiced speed that did not soften the violence of panic for those who waited. Ethan gave Noah name and symptoms in clipped phrases that hid the quake in his chest, and then he saw her across the room before he registered her as real. Ava stood at a bedside in blue scrubs, her hair pulled back, with the same discipline she wore on the train, and when she turned at the sound of Noah cry, her face changed with a shock as visible as lightning. For a second, the world narrowed to the space between them as it had months before. Yet now the silence rang with alarms and the sound of a child struggling for breath. Ava crossed the floor without looking away and guided Ethan to a gurney with a gentleness that did not compete with urgency. When she took Noah from his arms this time, there was no protest from anyone, because the language of emergency needed no translation. She spoke softly to him with the same calm cadence that had pulled him back from the edge on the rails, and the recognition in her voice carved through Ethan defenses in a single line. Noah's eyes fluttered, and his small hands found her collar, as if memory lived in muscle, deeper than thought. And that sight struck Ethan with a disbelief that bordered on faith. Ava called for saline and monitoring, with a voice that held command, and when the team moved around them, she never once let her focus slip from the small chest rising against her own. Ethan stood close, but apart, his body trembling now. That control had been surrendered again, and he realized with sudden clarity that he trusted her in a way he trusted no one else in this room, full of expertise. Noah convulsed once with a breath that snagged, and Ava braced him with absolute presence, murmuring the lullaby into his ear with a steadiness that felt like a promise made long before words. The episode passed in seconds that felt endless, and when the monitors steadied, a quiet sob broke from Ethan's throat before he could stop it. Ava looked up at him then, and the flood of relief and memory in her eyes mirrored his own, as if the 10 months between them had folded like paper under the weight of what still bound them. They worked together without speaking when the next tasks arrived. Tubes, hands, documentation, as if their bodies remembered a partnership they had never formally practiced. When the immediate danger eased, Ava placed Noah back into Ethan's arms with care, and he closed his eyes for a second to anchor himself in the warmth that proved the night had not taken another life from him. Only then did the sound of the room return in full, and with it the knowledge that they were not alone in this moment anymore. They moved to a quieter bay as the rush turned to vigil, and in the softer light, Ava stood at the foot of the bed watching Noah sleep with the same attentive stillness she had shown on the train. Ethan wanted to speak, but found that words formed too slowly for the surge of feeling that climbed his chest. He said her name once, testing it as a bridge rather than a demand, and she answered with his, as if the sound placed them in the same room again after months of speaking to absence. They exchanged the briefest summary of what had passed in 10 months, because the child demanded the center and everything else bowed to that priority with instinctive agreement. Noah stirred and reached for Ava's sleeve with a blind certainty that pulled a gasp of surprise from her lips and tears again from Ethan's eyes, because the gesture felt like recognition, not coincidence. When she cupped his small hand between her palms, the room seemed to soften, as if even the walls were listening. Ethan felt the surge of something close to hope rise through the dread he had carried since the corridor of that other hospital, and the realization frightened him with its brightness. Ava felt it too, and withdrew her hand gently, not in refusal, but in caution. Because every bright thing in her life had once been followed by a shadow shaped like her father. They spoke in low voices about tests and observation, and the mundane language of care that carried a quiet vow beneath it to be present through the long night. When the nurse stepped away, the hush between them thickened with what neither had dared to imagine surviving to this reunion. Ethan confessed without preface that he had replayed the lullaby for months, as if sound might summon courage, and Ava listened with a mixture of warmth and fear, because she had done the same without meaning to. The confession landed between them like a fragile artifact that belonged to both of them now. They sat near each other through the early hours, trading small details of their lives, since the platform without crossing the line that still frightened them into formal distance. Yet every glance drifted back to Noah and to each other with the same natural rhythm, and the romantic tension returned not as a surge, but as a quiet current that promised depth rather than explosion. As dawn approached and the city lightened outside the high windows, Ava felt the pull of something new and something old at once, and she wondered how long truth could remain postponed when fate had already repeated itself with such precision. Ethan felt the same unease, yet he could not deny the certainty that this reunion in the ER was not a coincidence, but a hinge on which the next chapter would turn whether he was ready or not. Noah slept at last in a peace earned through terror and skill, and the two adults who watched him breathe stood one breath apart, again held by memory and by a future neither of them yet understood, but both of them now feared to lose. Ethan left the hospital at mid-morning with Noah stable and sleeping under observation, and the weight in his chest felt both lighter and more dangerous because hope had returned to a place he had sealed with steel. He did not go home but to the office, where glass reflected the city in sharp, obedient lines, and assistants waited with careful faces that meant trouble had ripened in his absence. The first report landed on his desk before he removed his coat, and the headline cut with surgical precision, announcing that Morales Transportation had released documents accusing Blackwood Mobility of safety violations connected to a recent rail incident, and the implication was clear enough without accusation. A second alert followed, showing a social media clip from last night, filmed on the train with his son crying and a caption that questioned his competence as a father and as a leader. The timing was too perfect for coincidence, and the fingerprints on the move were familiar to anyone who had ever crossed Victor Morales in a negotiation that did not end in submission. Ethan listened as counsel explained the sequence with voices that tried to sound steady, while the market shifted in real time and the board called for an emergency meeting. The word Morales echoed through the room like a blade striking bone, and memory unspooled the image of Ava at Noah's side in the ER with that same calm that had frightened the storm out of him. The pieces aligned with a clarity that made him dizzy, and he felt the truth rise, not as suspicion, but recognition. When he opened the personnel database for the hospital where Ava worked, the last name Morales stared back at him like a verdict, and in a single breath, the bridge between tenderness and war collapsed. He sat through the board meeting with a composure that frightened even him. While directors debated optic strategy and containment, and the phrase "protect the brand" drifted through the room as if it were a holy text, not one of them spoke Ava's name, yet he heard it in every cautionary note, because now every kindness wore the shadow of motive in the light they lived by. By the time he left the meeting, the decision hardened within him, as cold as the steel of the towers around him, and the drive back to the hospital felt like a descent into a truth he both needed and feared to touch. Ava was at the nurse's station, reviewing charts when she saw him approach, and the change in his expression reached her before his words did. The warmth she had felt since dawn recoiled under a sudden chill she did not yet understand, and the knot she had carried since the platform tightened into alarm. Ethan asked for a private space with a politeness so formal it cut, and she followed without question because the air had shifted in a way she had learned to respect. In the quiet room near the waiting area, he closed the door with care as if trying not to wake a monster sleeping between them, and then he said her last name to test it aloud. Morales. The sound landed on her like a blow she had been bracing for since the platform, and she could not hide the truth of recognition that crossed her face at once. The world he had built from glimpses of her cracked into the shape of a battlefield, and the sweetness of the lullaby tangled with the bitterness of strategy in his mouth. He did not shout, because anger seldom required volume when it had patience and preparation to lean on. He told her what had broken in the markets while she paced backward, as if searching for a wall that would not arrive in time. He told her about the video and the safety accusations and the timing that wrapped last night in a narrative sharp enough to draw blood. Ava listened without interruption, and when he finished, she whispered that she had not known he was the Ethan Blackwood until weeks after the train, and that by then, fear had already taught her silence. He asked if she truly believed he would trust her less had she told him, and she answered with a ruinous honesty that she did not know what he would have believed, because his world had never been safe for people like her. The word "like" landed hard between them, because now it meant daughter of an enemy and ally by blood rather than choice. Ethan felt the heat rise at last, and with it the betrayal that burned hotter for having been preceded by tenderness. He asked her if any part of what happened between them had been an act, and she met his gaze without flinching, though tears gathered. Because truth did not require safety to stay upright, she said the only plan she had made that night was to keep his son breathing, and everything that followed had frightened her as much as it had pulled her forward. He wanted to believe her, and that desire frightened him, because wanting could be persuaded, and he could not afford persuasion. The room filled with the unsaid, and with the sound of machinery beyond the walls that kept children alive in ways power could not purchase. Ethan asked if her father knew who Noah was, and whether last night had been used as leverage by morning, and the horror in her face answered before her words did. She swore she had not told Victor anything that would place a child in his line of calculation, and the desperation in her voice cracked something in Ethan's chest, because he believed that fear, even as his training warned him, that motive often wore sincerity as armor. Ava sank to her knees without thinking the movement instinctive, as if confession required ground, and she begged him not to turn Noah into a bargaining chip in a war she had spent her life trying to outrun. She told him how Victor used affection like currency and loyalty like a debt, and how he had erased Miguel with a sentence that called loss inconvenience. Ethan heard the rawness in her words and saw the shape of a man he already knew from a lifetime of enemy briefings, and yet the image of Ava kneeling for mercy cut deeper than any press attack. He wanted to lift her, and he wanted to step back, and the conflict tore through him with a violence that had no vocabulary. When he spoke again, his voice was low, with a restraint learned in rooms, where everything cost something. He said he could not be certain of her now, and that to protect his son, he would treat every connection to Morales as a potential threat, including her. Ava felt the sentence land like exile pronounced in the only place she had begun to feel seen again. She said she understood even as the understanding shattered her, because what choice did a man with an empire have when faced with a woman carrying the blood of the enemy and the echo of a lullaby in her throat. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, as if a line had been drawn between them with law rather than ink, and beyond it, Noah slept under wires and light, unaware that love was being tried by fire not its own. Ethan asked one more question, and his hands trembled as he did whether Victor had predicted that she would meet him on that train. Ava stared at the floor because the worst truth was that her father believed every movement in the city bent eventually toward his design, and she had never been given enough proof to call him wrong without doubt. The answer did not need to be spoken to move between them like smoke, and Ethan felt the last of the innocence he had allowed himself burn away in that silence. Ava rose at last with a dignity that did not beg and did not surrender, and told him that she would leave the unit if he asked, though her voice broke not for herself, but for what would be taken from Noah if fear decided his world entirely. Ethan did not ask her to leave because even now he could not bring himself to sever the single thread that had stilled his son's terror when nothing else had. Instead, he said he would handle Victor with every means at his disposal, and that she should keep her distance until the truth of last night could no longer threaten the child they both cared for in different ways. The words distance and until fell between them like a sentence without end, and Ava nodded because survival had taught her how to accept terms even when they cut. As he turned to go, the room seemed to contract around them, and the strain of what remained unsaid pressed against their throats with unbearable weight. Ethan paused at the door with his hand on the handle, as if testing whether the choice could still be undone, and then he left carrying the truth that nearly killed the fragile thing, growing between them, not with force, but with the slow certainty of a man who believed power could still solve what love could not. Ethan walked out of the hospital into a city that no longer felt neutral, and the glass towers that once answered to his name now reflected a man stripped to intention alone. By noon, the board convened again under the pressure of collapsing shares and the widening echo of the Morales accusations, and Ethan listened without interrupting as directors spoke of risk exposure, fiduciary duty, and the optics of compromise. When they finished, he did not answer with numbers. He answered with a decision that stunned the room into a sudden quiet. He said he was terminating the hostile acquisition of Morales Transportation, effective immediately, and that Blackwood Mobility would withdraw from the bidding process by end of day. The room erupted with disbelief, followed by anger, framed as reason, and fear framed as prudence. And when the noise peaked, Ethan placed a folder on the table and slid it forward with the calm of a man who had already crossed the point of negotiation. Inside were records from a long investigation he had kept dormant for leverage that he had never intended to use until this morning. The documents traced Shell Company's safety violations, bribes, and pressure tactics, linked to Victor Morales and the rail incidents that had quietly fed his rival's advantage. Ethan told them he would release it all within the hour, and that he would testify if necessary, because he would not allow a child to be used as the shadow justification for a lie that could kill more than reputation. Silence returned heavier than before, and in it Ethan felt the first true severing from the life that had made him powerful. The chair of the board asked him if he understood the cost, and Ethan answered that the cost had already been charged the night a woman sang his son back into breath. By the time the meeting ended, the votes were counted not in his favor, and the press releases were prepared before he reached the elevator. The headline broke before dinner that Ethan Blackwood had been removed as chief executive by a unanimous vote, citing reckless unilateral action and exposure to unacceptable legal risk. In the same cycle, the evidence went public, and analysts turned their fire onto Victor Morales with questions that no influence could redirect fast enough. Ava learned of both storms while charting in the late afternoon, and the world narrowed to the shape of two names colliding across screens. Her phone buzzed again from the number she had not saved, and this time she answered because running no longer offered cover. Victor's voice was measured, but the veneer had cracked, and he demanded to know what she had told Ethan and how his move had been anticipated so precisely. Ava did not raise her voice and did not soften it either, as she said she had told no one anything of strategy, and that if he had been exposed, it was because truth can outrun power when it decides to move. Victor accused her of betrayal, and she answered that betrayal requires a loyalty she had never been granted. He reminded her of the roof that once sheltered her, and she reminded him of the funeral he called inconvenient. When he threatened consequences, Ava ended the call with a steadiness that surprised even her because 10 months of restraint had taught her the difference between fear and clarity. At dusk, rain began to fall with the steady insistence that the city always answered to gravity in the end and not to wealth or will. Ethan left the building that no longer belonged to him without security for the first time in years, and the sensation felt both dangerous and strangely light. He tightened his coat around Noah and walked into the downpour as cameras surged forward, with questions that felt already old because the truth he had chosen did not need further embellishment. The rain soaked through his collar and plastered the child blanket to his chest, and for a moment the city noise receded into a soft roar that made the sidewalk feel like the edge of the world. Across town, Ava finished her shift and stepped into the same rain, carrying the weight of a lifelong tether she had just cut with both hands. She drove with wipers pounding and chest trembling, with the echo of her father's final words, and the knowledge that she had said something irrevocable with the calm of a woman no longer seeking permission. The rain gathered along the curb outside the hospital when she saw Ethan standing there without the buffer of guards or aides or glass, and the sight arrested her with a shock of recognition. He held Noah under his coat with care, and the child slept through the storm, as if trusting that whatever power had once surrounded his father had never been the true shelter. Ava pulled to the curb without thinking and stepped out into the rain, and for a second they only watched each other through the curtain of water, as if crossing the space would require a language neither had yet learned to speak. Ethan did not move first because he had already moved enough for one day, and Ava crossed the distance with her hair darkening under the rain, and her steps certain despite the fear that had just burned the last bridge behind her. She took Noah from his arms to shield him better, and the gesture carried no defiance, now only the quiet competence of a mother who recognizes priority without debate. Ethan told her what he had done without embellishment, and she told him she had cut herself off from Victor without asking what price that would demand next week or next year, because some choices do not wait for safety. The rain swallowed their words, yet meaning did not need volume to settle between them. Cameras hovered at the margins, but no one dared intrude on the raw simplicity of the scene, as if the city itself understood that this moment did not belong to spectacle. Ethan felt the absence of his former world with a clarity that frightened him, and then felt the presence of Ava and Noah with a steadiness that surprised him more. He said he did not know what came next, and Ava answered that not knowing had been her home for years, and it had not killed her the way lies almost had. Noah stirred and made a small questioning sound, and Ava shifted him with the same instinct that had first tied them together in terror and relief. Ethan reached out to touch the edge of the blanket and stopped, then continued as if finally allowing himself the ordinary permissions he had denied under the weight of consequence for too long. The rain softened to a mist, and the streetlights haloed each drop like a quiet confession that nothing needs to be loud to be real. They did not declare love and did not promise anything, because life had taught them that vows spoken too soon can become knives. They stood in the weather with the world rearranging itself around their small circle and allowed the truth to exist without decoration, that a billionaire can choose to lose and still find something that money cannot replace, and a daughter can choose to leave her father and still claim a lineage built on breath rather than power. When they parted that night, it was not in silence, but in a shared understanding that they had crossed a river that does not allow easy return, and that both of them would now live on the far bank, whether they were ready or not. 3 years later, the train slid along the Maryland suburbs under a sky clean with autumn light, and Noah pressed his face to the window with a laugh, as houses and trees raced by like friendly ghosts. Ava sat beside him with a sketchbook in her lap, now smudged with fingerprints and notes from patients who came through the small free clinic she had opened near the river, where no one asked for insurance before asking what hurt. Ethan sat across from them with a backpack full of tablets and wires, bound for the community center, where he spent his mornings teaching code and robotics to children who had learned too early that the world does not begin with fairness, yet still holds space for skill if someone is willing to show them. The house where they lived breathed with ordinary sounds. Now drawer slides a kettle, heating a child running down a hallway, with shoes only half tied, and all of it felt like a miracle neither of them ever tried to explain too loudly. Noah turned and climbed into Ava's lap and said mama with the certainty that still astonished her, and then twisted toward Ethan with equal authority to say mama as if language had decided that love no longer obeyed the rules he was born under. They laughed, both of them at once, and the sound held no fear in it anymore. At the clinic that morning, Ava had stitched a hand and set a bone, and listened to a woman who had nowhere to sleep, and she had done it with the same steady presence she once gave a child on a train, because some skills are learned in crisis and never leave. At the center, Ethan had knelt beside a boy who believed circuits only sparked when you were lucky, and he had shown him that luck answers those who keep their hands steady, and the boy believed him because belief travels faster when it is earned through patience. In the quiet between tasks, they sometimes remembered other versions of themselves, moving through glass buildings and shadowed corridors, but memory no longer hurt in the way it once had, because it had been given a place to rest. That afternoon, they took the train together, not for necessity, but for the simple pleasure of watching Noah narrate the world with his hands and voice until the rails sang beneath them and the car filled with conversations that did not belong to anyone in particular. Halfway to the city, a thin cry rose from the back of the car and tightened into the familiar sound that once divided a room into fear and judgment. The mother stood swaying with a baby whose face colored with distress, while eyes turned with impatience that pretended not to be dread. Ava felt the old signal move through her without thought and set Noah gently into Ethan's arms, and rose before a single accusation could form. When she reached the woman, she did not ask permission. She simply gathered the child into the cradle of her body and pressed cheek to cheek while humming a song that still knew how to count breaths back into skin. The mother stared at her with the helpless gratitude of someone standing at the lip of terror, and the baby stilled in seconds with a long sigh that loosened the entire car. Conversation returned with a different tone now, and the woman mouthed thank you with tears bright on her lashes. Ava handed the baby back with a smile that asked nothing more, and returned to her seat where Ethan watched her with a quiet awe that had never faded. Noah waved at the other child with solemn dignity, as if acknowledging a small rite of passage completed. The train carried on, and for a moment time folded, so that past and present touched without pain, and the lesson they had learned 3 years ago breathed again through ordinary air. Sometimes the unthinkable is not betrayal, it is choosing love when power would be easier, and choosing it again in small rooms without witnesses. They did not speak the lesson because it lived where words were unnecessary, in the cadence of their days, and the way Noah slept, with one hand always seeking another. At home that night, they ate soup at the small table, and the rain came soft against the windows as it once had in a different life, and Ethan helped Ava wash dishes while Noah drew butterflies on the floor with crayons he named after colors that did not yet exist. When the child grew heavy with sleep, Ethan carried him down the hallway and paused in the doorway to watch Ava straighten the sketches left behind, and felt the simple satisfaction of belonging to a room that asked him to be nothing more than present. Later, when the lights were low and the house quiet, they sat together and let the silence that had once frightened them now rest as companionship. The world beyond their door still moved with its urgent appetites, but inside these walls, the rhythm had finally settled into breath. And on another train far across the city, a baby stirred and cried, and a stranger shifted closer with open arms, and the circle widened by one more quiet act that would never make the news, yet would change a life all the same. Now, before this story ends, let us turn to you for just a moment. If this journey of unexpected kindness and chosen family touched something in you, tell us where you are listening from and whether a single scene stayed with you after the final page. Your comments help this channel grow and help these stories reach others who may need them at just the right time. If you have ever witnessed a moment where a stranger became a helper, share it with us below, because those stories remind us that courage is not rare, it is simply quiet. If you want more stories like this about healing romance and the difficult beauty of choosing love in ordinary places, subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter in our Unthinkable love series. Turn on notifications to join us when the next story arrives, because every week we return with new lives, new risks, and new chances at hope. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that their worst day does not get the final word, share this episode with them tonight. Thank you for listening and for carrying these characters with you beyond the screen, because in that act the story continues. If this story made you pause, even for a second, if it made you think about the last time someone helped you when you did not expect it, or the last time you helped a stranger without knowing why, then take a moment right now and let us know in the comments what scene stayed with you the most and what it reminded you of in your own life. Because your experiences are what turn these stories into something living beyond the screen. Tell us where you are listening from, whether it is New York, California, Texas, or somewhere across the ocean, because this community grows stronger every time we see how far these stories travel. If you are a parent, a single parent, or someone who carries responsibility alone, and this story spoke to you in a personal way, your voice matters here, and your story may be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If you enjoyed this journey of healing, love, sacrifice, and quiet courage, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next episode in our Unthinkable Love series, where we explore the moments that change ordinary lives forever. Turn on notifications so you are the first to hear the next story, because each new chapter brings a new test of the heart, a new twist of fate, and a new chance at hope. If you believe that kindness still has power in a world that often rewards the opposite, share this story with one person who might need that reminder tonight, because sometimes one shared story is enough to stop someone from feeling alone. Your likes, your comments, and your shares are what keep this channel alive and growing, and every small action you take helps these stories reach someone who may be standing in the middle of their own unseen crisis right now. And finally, if you would like to see more stories about unexpected family second chances, billionaire redemption, single parents, or quiet heroic love, let us know in the comments what themes you want next, because we read every suggestion, and many of our future stories are inspired directly by you. Thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for opening your heart to these characters. And thank you for being part of a community that still believes in compassion even when the world feels loud and unforgiving. Until the next story arrives, remember that sometimes the smallest moment, the quietest choice, and the simplest act of kindness can change a life forever.